welcome to the 22nd annual Walter Rodney Lecture. I am virtually starstruck to be in the presence of today's lecturer, the wonderful Professor Christopher Emdin, who is from Teachers College, Columbia University, and he'll be talking to us on the topic, Everyday Activism, honoring Walter Rodney through education for the Ratchet generation. And though many of us are still going to be learning, those of us who are thinking about Ratchet in another way, you know, those bad boys who went to high school and were found with a ratchet in your pocket, you know what that meant. But it might not be so far off, but we will hear more about the Ratchet generation and, more importantly, how education can reach them. And I won't introduce Chris Emdin, but I mean, he has some fabulous TED Talks out there. I'll ask those of you who are interested in effective pedagogy to tune into his TED Talks. But let's talk a little bit more before I introduce our next speaker to us. Walter Rodney was memorialized very effectively by one of the eminent academics of our institution, the University of the West Indies, Professor Emeritus Rupert Lewis. And he wrote an article that was carried in the Jamaica Observer about Walter Rodney and the Black Lives Matter movement. And I just want to give you a bit of that article, just to set the context for what we are doing today. Professor Lewis writes, Walter Rodney was born on March 23, 1942, and was murdered on June 13, 1980, at the age of 38, leaving behind Patty's wife and 3 children, Shaka, Kanini, and Asha. His funeral in Georgetown, Guyana was attended by thousands of people. Professor Lewis says he was in attendance representing the Workers' Party of Jamaica. The article goes on to say that when he was only 11 years old, he was aware of the actions of the British imperial power and the indignities of colonial subjugation when Walter Rodney would have been involved in the People's Progressive Party in 1953. He talks about Rodney's education, having been educated at Queen's College in Georgetown, winning a scholarship to the then University College of the West Indies, now the UWI, graduating in 1963 with a first-class honors BA, and he went on to complete his doctoral dissertation on a history of the Upper Guinea coast at the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London in 1966 at the age of 24. During his undergraduate years, he traveled to Cuba, intrigued the Castro. He goes on, Lewis, that radical intellectual thinking in the New World influenced groups throughout the region which championed the dismantling of plantation agriculture, campaigned for land reform, lobbied the development of manufacturing, Black entrepreneurship, and the end to endemic racism in the region. Associated with these youthful movements were women activists. I want to recommend that article to you as we contextualize the work of Rodney and his work in education. As we speak of education, I will now introduce to us the mother of the Institute of Caribbean Studies, a champion for serious causes. We as staff know of her winning champion ways as she continues as an academic of extreme note to also ensure that there is justice within the academy. I'm talking about the director of the Institute of Caribbean Studies and the senior lecturer in the Institute, Dr. Sonia Stanley Nair, who will now give the welcome and remarks.
Thank you so much, Hugh. It is my absolute pleasure to be here for this occasion. You know, Walter Rodney's legacy is not only in the books, The Groundings with My Brothers, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. His legacy isn't only in what he wrote, but certainly in the ways that we have tried to keep Walter Rodney's memory alive through events such as these. And of course, we have to make sure that generations coming after us, after the 1970s, 80s and 90s, the ones to come, will absolutely remember, keep Walter Rodney's memory alive. It is absolutely our pleasure to welcome you to this event. The Institute of Caribbean Studies was established in 1987. We are now 33 years old. This is the 22nd annual Walter Rodney Lecture, so you know that we have, in fact, made activism, made the pedagogy around activism a central part of what we do in the Institute of Caribbean Studies. There are 3 undergraduate programs and 3 graduate programs, and there is no program in the Institute of Caribbean Studies where students, either at the undergraduate level or graduate level, interface with Walter Rodney. The lectures have been delivered over the years by eminent scholars, activists, and practitioners such as Professor Brian Meeks, Mr. Bunga Jerry Small, Professor Emeritus Rupert Lewis, and most recently, last year, in fact, Miss Dahlia Harris of note in the theatrical circles and media circles in Jamaica. This annual lecture marks the anniversary of the Rodney riots. We are smack on the day of October 16, highlighting the Rodney riots of 1968. And of course, we are celebrating the academic, we're celebrating the organic intellectual, we are celebrating the activist in Walter Rodney, a Guyanese, but of course, sojourned to Jamaica, where his impact will never be forgotten. I take this opportunity to welcome you once more to not only the Institute of Caribbean Studies, where I would hope that you would tune into our various events, subscribe to our YouTube page, and also check us out on Instagram, on Twitter, and so on. We are here to continue the task of educating the now generation, but also the generations to come. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Stanley Nair, for that wonderful welcome. And we know that normally we would have been in N1 in the Faculty of Humanities and Education for this event. You know, this new normal, as it is called, has opened this to much wider audiences, and we want to welcome everyone all over the world. We are aware that we have viewers tonight from all over the world, all over the Caribbean region. Big up all of the people of the Caribbean. It's not often that we get together as in this manner, so we want to big you up and welcome you. But everyone everywhere in the world, Africa is in the house, I am sure. And we want to hear what questions and comments you have later on in the program. So we look forward to your engagement. Please feel free to post your comments in the chat box, and we will hear some of those. Thanks again, Dr. Stanley Nair. Now, the Institute of Caribbean Studies, for those who don't know, students come to the Institute and they become very starstruck, because within the Institute, there are quite talented persons who are not only interested and very involved in the theoretical approach to the academy, but who are very involved in many other ways in doing and practicing what they teach. And one such person is Michael Holgate. You would know him from his work with groups like Ratchet. He is a tutor, resident tutor at the Philip Sherlock Center for the Performing Arts on campus. And he is an excellent multiple award-winning playwright, choreographer, composer, dancer, actor. I'll use Professor Stanley Nair's word math. And so we're going to see an excerpt from a production written and directed by Michael Holgate. The production Bone of Contention was performed by the Irving Hall Players. I hear the Irvingites in the house making up some noise already, but the university is so talented that within each hall, you have a strong choir, strong set of players, and so on. So please sit back and enjoy this excerpt from Bone of Contention.
Nobody talks about blackness until Walter Rodney came.
He was a lecture anywhere, anytime. He was a fairly esteemed academic. And yet, identify with the struggles of black people all around the world.
Every African has the responsibility to understand the system. And the works of its overthrow.
Walter was such a passionate and forceful speaker, but I don't ever recall him telling we the people to rebel, but I do remember him telling us to stand up for our rights.
I remember 1968.
It was a time of deprivation.
30% of the workforce was unemployed.
And 67% worked for less than $10 a week. Yes, man. I remember 1968 too. About 100 times was strike because the housing
too. He tried to give the people hope, but the government of Jamaica saw otherwise.
They saw a lecturer with enough time on his hands to speak to the students about their blackness.
And to seek out the poor man in his community, to speak about upliftment.
Nobody gives anybody else freedom. If freedom is something that you have been given, it means you are a slave. Freedom is something that you should fight for, or you are a slave.
They asked the Vice Chancellor Philip Sherlock to get rid of him, but the Vice Chancellor said no because he had done nothing wrong. You see, they did not want a radical oppositional force to threaten the present political system of Jamaica that was only 6 years old. So they took matters into their own hands and banned him from ever entering the country again.
And the stores on King Street burned to the shouts of Black Power. Black Power! For the students, it wasn't about a lecture, it was about inequalities. Big businesses, both foreign and local, were attacked. Air Jamaica, JPS.
Chinese shops. By the end of the week, over 100 persons were arrested. No students were arrested, but because we had gone to protest in our red gowns, the government branded us as hooligans and said we'd be dealt with accordingly.
By this time, the campus was surrounded by police. But they couldn't step on campus because this was a Caribbean territory.
Go into your libraries and you will see Europeans under all their listings. Even in Africa, there is no entry for Africans. Africans who have been raped from the soil have mysteriously disappeared and become neutrals.
Walter Rodney was assassinated in 1980, 38 years ago. Do you know who he is? Do you know who you are?
Wonderful performance. Come on, put your hands together and clap that performance. Bone of contention by the Irving Hall players. And if you clap, you know, it will go into the universe and it creates vibration and so don't think you're not going to reach the performers. Give them some love. Really, and that's such a wonderful way to introduce us to the energy of Walter Rodney. Those pictures that you saw of students sitting at his feet, that was the kind of groundings that he had, not just with students, but with the common man, Rastafari, and all the people who brought the academy into the community. And that is such a perfect match for the speaker that we're going to hear from this evening. Also, one of the things that you saw in that presentation were these red gowns. Some of you may not have wondered what you were seeing in those red gowns. Those are the academic gowns of the University of the West Indies, which students wore to classes. And they became a very big symbol in iconic images that we still have today of students of the university running down Mona Road from police as they were trying to get to Jamaica House in order to present to the government their demands on behalf of the people of Jamaica. Great activism, which is the tradition of this university. And Rodney is one of a pantheon of great intellectuals who have engaged the world with a challenge to do the right thing. And so it's a great moment for us to be looking at Walter Rodney as we enter the National Heroes Weekend in Jamaica It's full time now we hear from the lecturer that we're here to listen to. But before we hear from Professor Chris Emdin, we're going to hear from another professor, a brilliant light in the academy, a very clear guide and mentor of many academics as well, professor in culture, gender, and society here at the University of the West Indies, Mona campus. And she will be introducing our guest speaker. Please help me welcome Professor Donna Hope.
Thank you, and of course, pleasure to be joining this event this evening and to be a part of it, of bringing the discussions about Walter Rodney and ensuring that we are all fully au fait with some of the happenings from 1968, which took place. Many people watching were not born, but of course it's very important for us to engage with the narratives and with the ideas that come from that era, so we understand who we are in the 21st century. One of the things about me that many people don't know is that I spent 6 years of my academic life, a little more than that, but 6 years teaching in the Department of Government, working with Professor Rupert Lewis. And so I had to engage quite significantly with the works of Walter Rodney, Marcus Garvey, and others. So it's always a pleasure to be a part of the discussions around Walter Rodney's own political philosophies and his contribution to the Caribbean region. And I'm really looking forward to what my brother, Chris Emdin, pick up yourself, Chris, good to see you, Professor Chris Emdin, will be sharing with us today from his own perspective as a radical Black activist in the academy. So without further ado, let me go ahead now and introduce Professor Chris Emdin to the gathered audience and welcome everyone, of course, who's here with us joining from all over the world. Who is Professor Chris Emdin? Professor Chris Emdin is the creator of the hip-hop battle, the hip-hop ed social media movement, and the science genius battles. And I had the pleasure of meeting Chris as a part of the version that was taken here in Jamaica. He's the author of the award-winning book, Urban Science Education for the Hip-Hop Generation, and the New York Times bestseller, For White Folks Who Teach the Hood and the Rest of Y'all Too. He has maintained a relationship with Jamaica through his work as an educational activist involved in the expansion of hip-hop ed, activism, and science genius, which manifested in the Dancehall Genius competition, now in its second year. Dr. Emdin, Professor Emdin, is currently Associate Professor of Science and Education in the Department of Mathematics, Science and Technology at Teachers College at Columbia University in the USA, and serves as Director of the Science and Education Program and Associate Director of the Institute for Urban and Minority Education. Very busy man. He's an alumni fellow at the Hutchins Center at Harvard University and also serves as team ambassador for the U.S. Department of State and Minorities in Energy ambassador for the U.S. Department of Energy. He's a social critic, public intellectual, and science advocate whose commentary on issues of race, culture, inequality, STEM, and education have appeared in dozens of influential periodicals, including the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and the Washington Post. Professor Emdin holds a PhD in urban education with a concentration in mathematics, science, and technology, and master's degrees in both natural sciences and education administration, and bachelor's degrees in physical anthropology, biology, and chemistry. He's a well-rounded individual, and of course, someone who is very active on social media. Hashtag science genius, hashtag, and of course, this means that Chris Emdin is well prepared to deliver today's lecture for our annual Walter Rodney Memorial Commemoration here in the Institute of Caribbean Studies. Please join me in welcoming my colleague, friend, and brother, Professor Chris Emdin. Thank you so much.
That's such an amazing introduction, Dr. Hope. I'm deeply appreciative. And everyone, deeply humbled to be here. Doubly and triply humbled to deliver this lecture. The Rodney lecture is to be asked to do it means a lot to me. And I'll begin today with my first introduction to Walter Rodney. So I was probably about 12 years old. My dad, who was a graduate of Howard University, had a pile of old books that he had, in the basement. And he asked me to go and carry some of his old books because he was trying to construct a library in our home. And so I went down there and I picked up the book, and I picked up the box, and on the top of the box was this book, and the book was How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. And it was the edition of the book that had Vincent Harding, who wrote the introduction. And so if anyone knows that version of the book, it's really intriguing. It has these white hands holding Africa, in a backdrop of blue space and white stars beneath. And it struck me because this concept of how Europe underdeveloped Africa was just so foreign. Because my thinking, my understanding, my experiences, the media I'd seen, what has been celebrated around me was always one of the idolizing of the artifacts that were constructed by Europe. We loved European cars. We like European fashion. You aspire to be able to have a nice, French meal. So all the aspirations I had as a young person were about looking to the white hands that ripped apart were who I looked to as having the sort of like the face to look towards. And what was also intriguing about that cover was that it talked about Europe and underdevelopment of Africa, and that struck me. But the blue backdrop with white stars in the back, and Africa in red reminded me so much of the red, white, and blue of the United States. And so to me, it was an interesting identification of Europe's work on Africa, but then looked at America being in the backdrop or the foreground of that happening. And what struck me about that then strikes me today same way that when Walter Rodney was articulating the underdevelopment of Africa. And it's also really important that we talk about the fact that the word that was used was underdeveloped. It didn't talk about the annihilation of, it didn't talk about the bombing of, or the utter destruction of Africa. The word underdeveloped is significant for a very interesting reason, because it's not about the destruction, but it's about underdevelopment. Underdevelopment kind of conjures up the imagination, the concept that it's not that I will destroy you, I will only underdevelop you. Because if I underdevelop you, you can still serve as a class that serves me. Like underdevelopment as a theory of existence is one that understands the hierarchies in social life, that says that power cannot maintain itself unless there is a class that can be siphoned off of, or that its energy can be removed. And so underdevelopment is significant, and it applies to my lecture that talks about honoring Walter Rodney through education for the Ratchet generation, because this concept of underdevelopment is at the crux of what happens with the experiences of Black and brown bodies in education systems. It's never about the destruction of young folks, it may be the destruction of their souls, but it's about the destruction of their souls through a curriculum of underdevelopment. Underdevelopment is about giving you information while robbing you of a sense of self. Underdevelopment is exploiting your labor while at the same time selling the fruits of your labor back to you. And underdevelopment is about creating a situation where you will always look at me as the ideal. And so I will teach you through the system of education to replicate what I do, or try to be like me, while ensuring that the landscape never makes you seem equal to me. Education globally, where we're talking about the Caribbean or United States, where we're talking about Africa, we're talking about wherever across the globe, the system of education is predicated on the concept of underdevelopment that Walter Rodney articulated in How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. And I want us to look at schools as a microcosm, as a place in which those larger strands of underdevelopment get played out. There's no place where young folks go more readily, where they learn a sense of self or a lack of worth than in schools. And in any instance where we are pursuing content knowledge, we're doing so while not focusing on knowledge of self or an understanding of the process of underdevelopment. We're doing young folks a disservice, because it's not education at all. And to follow Walter Rodney's tradition is to understand the significant difference between education and schooling, between underdevelopment and growth and knowledge of self and understanding. One can go into schools and not be educated. You might receive content knowledge, but not receive soul knowledge. And entire enterprise around Walter Rodney's legacy is about the distinction between processes that were framed as though they edify, when in reality they only serve to foster the concept of underdevelopment and the feeling of less thanness and the pursuance of an ideal of a population who will never let you in. I've oftentimes said that the conundrum of the Black intellectual in a contemporary society is the training to articulate their ideas in the way of those who are the colonizers. And in pursuing that goal, shedding the sense of self they have that connects them to community. That the system of education, even for those who hold supposedly high intellect, is about the accumulation of information and not the sustaining of the soul. And it's the accumulation of information at the expense of connecting to communities. And so you will have a young person in K-12 education across the globe who learns that the higher you go, the more you should not sound like those people. Don't talk like those people. Don't engage with those people. You are better than those people. You are going to be the chosen few. And you pursue a system of education that gets you higher technically while removing you from your roots. And before long, once you've reached the height of the level that you think you're supposed to aspire to, and you say, I've chased you, European thinking, colonial mindset, my whole entire life, I have let go of my community. I've pursued what you told me to do. I've been quiet and docile and learned my physics and learned my chemistry and learned my history that was given to me through your lens. And then when I get in and say, I am here, let me in as your equal, they will say, where do you come from? They will look at the color of your skin and deny you your truth. And by that time, you say, well, if I can't be let into your world, let me return to the world from whence I came. But then you've spent decades of your life erasing your identity from whence you came. And you're stuck in an intellectual, metaphorical, psychological, and social-emotional purgatory, where you are not destined to fit into their world, but you can no longer return to the world from whence you came. And that's what Walter Rodney's work did and was about. It was about the concept of hybridity. It was about being like him, of high intellect, the writer of books, going to London to get the degree, understanding Marxist theory and social theory, and engaging in Africa and across the globe, and making deep connections to academic ideas and principles, but still being a man of the people. Still creating a political force that was empowering those who were not supposed to be let into the political structure. His demise, his ostracizing, the ostracization of Walter Rodney was not about his political beliefs per se. There are a lot of folks who have radical political beliefs. There are a lot of folks who can use the lexicon of the power wielder. The difference between him and any other intellectual who can wax poetically about the concepts and the ideas was that he went back. And beyond going back, he was welcomed back because they recognized the humility in him, that his credential did not divorce him from his authenticity. So let's go back to education. How can we have a system of education, whether we're talking about elementary school or we're talking about graduate school, where young folks don't understand that the purpose of education is to attain information for the purpose of liberation, a liberation of self and a liberation of community. You get the degree, you pursue the highest scores, simply for the sake of garnering enough information to understand the landscape of oppression and utilize that information to garner the masses to be able to move across the landscape towards freedom. But not just those with the credential and who have pursued the education, but also the strong ones amongst us who have denied the education of the colonizer. And this reshifting, this reframing is what Walter Rodney did. This is the essence of his work. It's this idea that, well, okay, I've got the information. Let me go and set the folks free. And saying, no, you've got the information so you can go back and share that information for the folks who are stronger than you. It's the reimagining of the process of schooling to understand that those who might not have made it through schools were probably the strongest ones. If the system of education is predicated on incarcerating the mind, body, soul, and spirit of the revolutionary in the pursuit of academic knowledge, the robbing of your freedom of expression, education is based on that theory and ideology, and many of us have been successful in a system of education through it, it actually means then that the weaker ones were the ones who were successful. The weak ones are the ones that say to the colonizer and the imperialist and the neo-colonizer and the neo-imperialist, oppress me more as I pursue being like you. The weak ones are the ones who divorce themselves of their authentic self in the pursuit of a model that does not look, sound, or act like them. The strong ones are the ones that stand staunchly in opposition to the colonization or the cloning of the mind and body and spirit. The ones who are strong enough to say no are the ones who get kicked out. And then we have a framing, a really problematic framing of the ones who left as the ones who couldn't make it. Well, yes, they couldn't make it in the sense that they could not make their souls bend to the whims and will of their oppressor. So those of us who are weak enough to adopt the language and get the credential, the opportunity now is, what do you do with it? And I make the argument that what you do with it is return to the communities and enter into the system of education. Folks can be historians, folks can be philosophers, folks can be theorists who wax poetic to other theorists. You can write all the papers that get cited by a bunch of other folks. I'm unconcerned if that's your goal. For me, the work is in education. Because Rodney's work is in education. He was a teacher. How do I know he was a teacher and not a script follower? And there are distinctions. A script follower is a person who takes the job and just follows the scripts and the information of other folks. A leader, a teacher, is one who touches the souls of young folks. They don't run around with red robes when you've been banned from the country, advocating for the fact that this should not happen to you if you did not touch their souls. That is the work of the educator. The educator gets the credential, returns to the community, informs the young folks, and uses the fervor of youth armed with information to be the path towards revolution. If your youth is lost, you reclaim your youth. You become eternal by sparking the imagination of youth. That is the work. That is the work. And when you arm them with information, with that youthful exuberance and energy, you become the guide. Not the leader, the guide. Perhaps the scribe who writes down for them what needs to be said as you let them lead. And that should be education. Education should be a reimagining of the concept of curriculum. It should be the pursuit of scientific knowledge for the purpose of freedom and emancipation. That's how we honor Walter Rodney. And I want to also make clear that reading and understanding and thinking and swimming in the beauty of Walter Rodney is in itself a political act. Just to read the text is a political act. It's a radical turn towards freedom, a radical turn towards emancipation. And when he spoke of freedom and emancipation, it was not in the sort of like, emancipation or freedom of the country from British rule or from French rule, because he also understood fully that there's a concept of symbolic freedom, a symbolic emancipation, a dangling of making trinkets accessible to a bourgeoisie class to make them believe that that is freedom, and have them be the ones that separate themselves from the masses who deserve the opportunity. And this is not just a Walter Rodney conversation. I want us to also understand that if you place Rodney in context with other Black revolutionaries across the globe, it's the same formula that those who spoke truth to power, that fully understood liberation, were killed. Whether we're talking about Lumumba or Malcolm X, it's the same phenomenon. And most importantly, whether we're talking of George Floyd, now hear me out, because some folks say, well, George Floyd was a person who became a hero post his assassination. But what Rodney teaches me, what Malcolm X teaches me, is that all Black folks have the potential and the ability and the gift of revolution whenever it's their time to do it. Now, some of us have lost our season, have lost our time, have lost our opportunity in the pursuit of the trinkets or the positionality of the petite bourgeoisie. So those of us who've lost that opportunity don't recognize that you had this force of revolution within you. Because there was a season in your life, it could have been yesterday, it could have been today, it could have been 5 years ago, where this was the opportunity to be able to win. And perhaps the opportunity for George Floyd was in that moment where he called for his mother with truth and spoke to the ancestors that moved him from average person to superhero. And all of us have the potential to be superhero. That's why this lecture is named Everyday Activism, because the concept or the construct that activism is relegated to a population that has credential is problematic. Every person has the potential to be an activist. Everybody has a revolutionary within them. It is whether or not they choose to either walk into their legacy or betray it. However, school systems function to ensure that our potential for revolutionary thought and spirit has been robbed of us. So this notion of reading and re-understanding, this notion of engaging with the work as a political act, this notion of a radical departure from a hyper-capitalist and blind consumption space, this notion of departing from the idea that we are only to consume what folks have given us, even though it's based on what we've constructed and created. This notion of understanding that we, by virtue of our Blackness, our struggle, our movement from slavery to where we are today, hold within us this precious diamond. And that schools have become this obstacle course that says there is a bigger thing at the end. Drop your diamond on the floor in pursuit of it. And you followed all along to get a cubic zirconia. And somebody along the way picks up your diamond and attempts to sell it back to you. That is K-12 education. That is higher education. That is graduate school education, unless we heed the words of Walter Rodney and the model he set forth about how we must engage. the first task of the intellectual, the first task of the academic, the first task of the teacher is to unleash the revolutionary spirit within themselves and then model that spirit for young folks so that it may ignite new possibilities. It is in the pursuit of high intellect without losing the true self, without losing the core identity. And that is why I talk about the concept of ratchet. Now, Brother Hugh talked earlier about some folks think the ratchet is when you have the gunman them that have the ratchet in their pocket. But I meant exactly that, Brother Hugh. I meant the ratchet in that concept, in that construct. In the States, the same perception of the ratchet existed. That is, the ratchet is the weapon. Somebody rolls up to the spot and says, yo, I got the ratchet on me. That means I have the weapon on me, move. But concurrently, ratchet in contemporary hip hop linguistics, as articulated by brilliant Black women scholars, is about this perception of being less than, being relegated to the margins, not being able to engage with the rules of engagement for highbrow culture. The ratchet person is loud, the ratchet person is obnoxious, the ratchet person does not control their emotion, as though that is negative. And so the word ratchet connected to the word wretched, connected to Frantz Fanon's word, the wretched of the earth. So when you talk about somebody is ratchet, all you're saying is that they are the wretched of the earth. And Fanon told us that the wretched of the earth is the salt of the earth that can birth the revolution. These are Black folks. So when you call somebody ratchet and you're calling them wretched, you're actually also affirming the fact that you're utilizing a colonizer's lens to look at Black folks and view them as wretched. But Fanon teaches us that those who are wretched are the ones who must fight for revolution and freedom. So ratchet is that non-traditional mode of engagement. It is also the weapon. What I try to do in my work is a merging of both theories. The understanding that the ratchet is the weapon, it's the gun to be fearful of if you're on the wrong side of those who hold the ratchet. You ain't scared of the ratchet if you're the one who is in possession of the ratchet. I hope y'all follow me. So when we talk about the ratchet as weapon, those in possession of the ratchet are not fearful of the use of the ratchet because they hold the power. Concurrently, the ratchet, a la wretched, the wretched of the earth, are those who have a lowbrow disposition and modes of engagement that are not traditional. I would make the extension that those who are ratchet in the Caribbean, we look at the Rastafarians as the ratchet. They don't fit into the norms. They're out there on that side with their own belief system, the ratchet, the wretched of the earth. But if the wretched of the earth hold a spiritual, emotional, and psychological ratchet that they start becoming aware that they hold, then their ratchetness becomes a ratchet that they use to move the colonizer away from the path to freedom. So the embracing of ratchetness is the anchor of a contemporary iteration of Rodney's work as it relates to education. And so K-12 education, graduate school education has to be concurrently about the recognition of the ratchet you hold. A lot of folks can't walk into freedom because they don't understand their gifts. They don't understand the beauty of poverty. The inherent creativity that is birthed from being from the lowest socioeconomic status, the imagination that is activated when society robs you of wealth, does not give you opportunity, relegates you to the slums and the ghettos, does not give you any chance to be better than what they think you can be. They think that they are breaking you, but in reality, what they're doing is activating parts of you that they can never get. So they are constructing you by robbing you of resources. And so the absence of resources for Black and brown folks across the globe, it's a Pan-Africanist theoretical framework. So we can talk about the absence of resources through colonization or the absence of resources in a contemporary. The absence of resources births the creativity to help you to understand that you have a ratchet. The purpose of educators is to help young folks to understand the parts of their ratchet. The parts of their ratchet is that loudness and more embracive nature. The embracing of the loud and abrasive nature concurrently with an understanding of highbrow discourse, language, tools, merged together becomes the thing that breaks the landscape that allow folks to operate fully. You become fully free when you adopt and understand the language of the oppressors, but you're not imprisoned by it. You become fully aware when you're what I call ratchetemic, which is the merging of Ratchet identity concurrently with high intellect, the pursuance of both. And some folks say, well, how can you do both? The notion that you cannot do both is a Eurocentric way of knowing and being. The phrase that you've all sometimes heard, you know, he's a jack of all trades, a master of nothing, was constructed by a person that can only do one thing. The height of their genius was being able to construct a phrase that allowed us to demonize those of us who can do more than one thing. Look at Walter Rodman. Brilliant historian, orator, political individual, can create a political party. So he worked in government, he worked in history, he worked with the people. You read the book about his the brothers, the grounding with my brothers, and don't you hear the poetic pose in that? So he's a poet, a teacher, historian, and did all those things at high levels. Only those who can't do all things at high levels demonize those who can do that and say you are a jack of all trades and masters of nothing. You're only a master of one thing, and that's oppression. I feel sorry for you. The only thing that you have a gift at is making me feel broken. And when young folks understand the beauty and the complexity of their experiences, the gift of their poverty, the genius of dancehall, a localized culture that can create a music soundscape that can transform the landscape of the world. What? And then we sit and demonize those who do that work when that work has impacted and changed the globe. And you're looking for an exemplar that does not have soul in the music. You're so poor, all you have is notes. You're so poor, all you have is notes to read or notes to count. You're so poor, you only have banknotes to count and written notes to read. I'm so rich, I don't need to read those notes because music is in my being. And my knowledge of self is my wealth. And this is not to say that you don't pursue comfort. I'm saying the pursuit of individual wealth at the expense of collective growth is problematic. Garvey taught us this. Rodney and Garvey's tradition about collective empowerment, collective growth, collective movements, collective understandings of our authentic selves in schools. Transforming the landscape of who gets chosen to teach. I don't want you to teach if you hold the oppressor's mindset. You will only teach my students to be oppressed. Look, I say all this to recant one of my favorite quotes by James Baldwin. For all of us, in Walter's memory and tradition, you have to decide who you are and force the world to deal with you and not its idea of you. We must decide who we are going to be in this moment. Are we full Ratchet as weapon and the wretched of the earth, combining the gifts of who we are, connecting and sharing that with our communities to reimagine what genius looks like? Or will we be their idea of us that will always be the downtrodden, the less than, the broken? I don't know about you, but I know me, I refuse to adopt any language, any philosophy, any theoretical framework, or any political movement that is predicated on my brokenness for its strength. You know, I'm reminded of Mos Def in this moment, who wrote a song in 2006 called Fake Bonanza. And in that song, he described the landscape of what it was like in the early 2000s in New York City, where there were deaths upon deaths upon deaths at the hands of police officers, at the hands of other Black folks, and he talked about what it felt like to be imprisoned in that time. Long investigations and no firm leaves. $1 million flow and Black life is still cheap. When rent skyrockets and prospects plummet, then he said 10 murders, 10 days this summer. Talk about today's mathematics and 8 to O a key or the caliber on your ratchet. And I want to deconstruct that for y'all. The idea in 2006 of long investigations and no firm lead, how is that not Breonna Taylor? How is not that the SARS police group in Nigeria who are assassinating members of their own citizenry for the exploitation of localized wealth for the sake of self-betterment? What Mos Def talked about in 2006, Walter Rodney was talking about decades before, and we are experiencing right now. How long will we wait? How long will we wait to fully embody this theory? How long will we wait to fully push back against the systems that are designed to oppress us? How long? We have to heal from the Stockholm syndrome in the system of education. You know, the Stockholm syndrome is this psychological disorder where a person who's been victimized by another person starts developing feelings of love for the person who victimized them. So a person can be in a bank robbery. A person robs the bank. They go into the bank. They take all the money. Who at the bank? Money. They hold you hostage. And in the middle of the hostage that threatens your life, you start saying, I can understand why this person is holding me up. What if I told you the system of contemporary education is a psychological extension of the existing Stockholm syndrome framework, and it's a Stockholm syndrome that is an education where we are marrying ourselves to ideologies that don't benefit us. In closing, I want us to understand that education isn't European. Education isn't white. Learning isn't British. Learning isn't white. Deep thinking is not the colonizers. Deep thinking is not white. Therapy and healing is not of the oppressor. Their forms of therapy will force us to be more broken. But doing any of those things, which is education, learning, deep thinking, or therapy through the lens of a person that does not see the beauty of your blackness, the beauty of your ratchetness, and the ratchet within you, is upholding white supremacist ideology. In itself, it's not problematic. It's what we choose to do with it that becomes problematic. So how did Europe underdevelop Africa? Through us. How is Europe underdeveloping the souls and minds of Black folks in the Caribbean across the globe? Through those of us who persist in pursuing something not designed for us. And the only way to truly honor the legacy of Walter Rodney is to operate fully and wholly free, removing our egos and bringing our authentic selves back to the community, back to the ratchet. Be ratchet, but hold your ratchet. That is the path to freedom. Thank you so much.
And thank you so much, Professor Chris Emdin, for that powerful challenge to all of us, to the entire world, in your presentation this evening. Words that you have spoken have lit a fire, many of us, I am very sure. And there are a lot of questions that you're going to have to answer. The YouTube page is also very, very taken with the things that you're saying, and I'm seeing some eminent Jamaican educators there. I'm going to start with this question, in which the that Rodney was a part of. We in our own institution, and in an institution of influence. Is it that we are too happy now operating in safe spaces in these institutions? And I'm saying this, saying that there are many people who marched with Rodney, who ran down to King's House and all of that with Rodney, who are now in positions of influence. Right. You know, is it now that we are so happy operating in safe spaces, removed from that time, assuming the positions that you talk of, that education sometimes is a ladder to get to? And is it that many who cared about then Rodney then now start to live in a kind of social purgatory?
You know, my brother, that's such a brilliant question. And I want to be clear that there is a seduction in safety. And what I mean by safety, it's not even just emotional, psychological safety, but financial safety, not being found out that you were not who you said you were. It's a safety from uncovering your authentic truth. You see what I'm saying? Yes. And what institutions do, what systems do, what governments do, is it takes those who are in most close proximity to the revolutionary and seduces them with a safety from a revealing of their full selves. And sometimes the fear of the revelation of their full selves makes them separate themselves from the community and people. They become tools. He talked about this very much with the bourgeoisie. The bourgeoisie are not, the bourgeoisie are the workers of the colonizer. The colonizer doesn't do the work on his own. The colonizer does this work by identifying the weakest link seducing the weakest link with the concept of safety, and then extracting them from the community. And I'll tell you this, and I hate to go all the way here, but I'll go here. There's also a deliberate and intentional effort to undermine the revolutionary, to place them in positions of compromise, and then exploit their compromised position by moving them out of doing the work they were designed to do. And then ingraining into the consciousness of our population that we must exist in cancel culture without forgiveness. Let me explain further.
All right.
If you go online right now, the biggest thing that you will find is cancel culture. Somebody does one thing wrong, you cancel them. Now, this is not to say that some folks don't do egregious things. If you do something that's particularly egregious against your community, if you violate our sisters, if you violate children, there are certain things that we know in our culture historically are not allowed. Right. However, folks are not allowed the grace to slip up in this era. And I would argue that cancel culture is not an Afrocentric way of knowing and being. Our people have always been forgiving people who afford grace to their brothers and sisters because they understand that life is about navigating appropriately if your soul is right. Mm-hmm. So an Afrocentric philosophy, an Afrocentric ontology is one of holding high expectations but giving space for grace. A Eurocentric ideology is one that says, you do something wrong, I cancel you. So we've allowed our people to adopt a cancel culture ontology and erase themselves from the spirit of grace and forgiveness and high expectations. And then those same folks have put our leaders in compromising positions to make some mistakes. They give you a little money here. You take the money to feed your family. All of a sudden you're compromised. I will tell all your people you made a mistake. While I tell all your people, if you mess up once, we cancel you.
Yes, yes.
And so now the intellectual and emotional purgatory is to not be revealed for an error, E-R-R-O-R, and an era, E-R-A, that is all about cancellation rather than forgiveness. They extract those who can guide us forward and keep them as their handmaidens. Mm-hmm. And that happens more often than you would imagine.
Yeah. I'm gonna pick up on what you're talking about in terms of the paradigms of European thought, mm-hmm. which are part of how we have been, the track that we have been put on by captivity and all the other things that we know. Two things I want to raise very quickly. I'm looking at the ways in which representation and semiosis has been constructed. Mm. And the fact that the way in which language works in semiosis from a Western perspective with Saussure and the others, Barthes and so on, they look at the way in which something becomes something because of its difference. Mm-hmm. In a negative way.
Right.
And that was enlightening for me because it told me something at the heart of the type of education that we are using and the educational philosophy that we're using that is a problem. I'm using that now to talk about, I want to talk about Montesquieu, I want to talk about Immanuel Kant, I want to talk about David Hume, mm-hmm. and the ways in which they constructed while they were creating the very concept and pillars of knowledge that we as persons captive and otherwise in the West are following, that they at the same time were scientifically presenting papers about the superiority and inferiority of races and doing a ranking scheme, which was passing between Montesquieu and Kant about this. Talk about that missing part of our understanding in pedagogy, because we're not—
Whether we're talking Kantian philosophy, whether we're talking pedagogically and talk about a Dewey-esque, a Deweyan perspective, all of that. We must understand the theoretical frameworks that are constructed by people, and I won't say whether they're good or bad, but if a person is constructing a framework of philosophy in an era where a certain population is viewed as persistently less than, the nature of their work is inherently biased based on the context in which their work was embedded. Period. Mm-hmm. Now, we choose to adopt Kantian frameworks, Marxist frameworks, etc., as a way to articulate this idea of a more revolutionary way of existing in the world. However, who's to say they developed the ideas? It is more about the process of the articulation, identification, naming, archiving of ideas that we identify the beginning of thought. Kantian frameworks don't believe with Kant, Were there elders in Africa constructing how folks were engaging? We don't know. Why? Because their method of engagement were more complex than written text.
Right.
If my modes of engagement were more complex than written text, then I could never understand who constructed it first. And here's where it's problematic, because if my modes of engagement were more complex than written text, but I come from a lineage where the oral tradition of the griot was interrupted and not allowed to pass down the generational thought,
right.
Then I don't even understand the origins, but I know this by virtue of what I can do with that work. I know it's mine. You understand what I'm saying? If they write it down, but I could flip that, remix that, apply that in ways they can't, then there's something about that work and that framework that's inherently my own.
Yes.
It's only a person who constructed it traditionally can maneuver and manipulate it. We talk about scientifically, we talk about Watson and Crick and how they took the work of Rosalind Franklin. And she constructed the ideas. Watson and Crick took the idea of DNA and then they built on it. But at the end of the day, they have to come back to her work and expand it forward. Well, that's the same thing with what we consider today to be the work of the canon. Who named the canon? Look, if you're the canon, I'm the gunfire. If you're the cannon, I'm the smoke. If you're the cannon, I'm the metal that forged the cannon.
Yes.
I don't celebrate what the cannon produces when I made what the cannon needs to work.
There you go. Wow. A question. How do you reconcile your professorship and your ratchetness? And how does this work in Jamaica in 2020, where people that look like us can be both the colonizer and the colonized?
A brilliant question. And when I talk about this concept of Ratchetdemic, the book will be out sometime next year, and I'll share with you guys when the release comes. It's about understanding that you must operate at the height of both. Meaning, you can't be halfway ratchet and academic. Because you just ratchet.
That's a rockademic.
You know what I mean? Like, you can't be a rockademic. You know what I mean? You can't be a stone.
Yes.
And so for me,
yes.
Here's consistent, in the words of Maxine Green, I am always who I am not yet. Because I am always open to learning, listening, reading, consuming. A suit of knowledge is like water to me. I mean, to be an academic is about ensuring that whoever thinks they're going to judge me, I can stand toe-to-toe with you in an intellectual conversation. If I know who you are and we about to debate, I will ensure I know as much as you. Because here's the thing, what you know is not special. All you know is stuff you've memorized. It is easy for me to memorize information. The garnering of information from somebody's book. Give me the book, I'll learn it too. You ain't special. You can only memorize something somebody else gave you. So I could do that too. And then I hold the gift of my blackness, of my hoodness, of my Caribbeanness, and I hold that too. So when I engage with you, you will look at me as less than when I give my ratchet self. But then when we engage, I can match you and top you. So then I'm good. The only way that person has power over me is if I cannot match them on the academic front. So if I match them on the academic front and bring my authentic self that they can never be, I'm twice as good as they can ever be. And so this idea of the colonizer and the colonized, you know, folks, by the way, also, folks who look like you who serve as colonizer are the weakest ones. Because they're the ones who, you ever engage with somebody, and I ask people this question all the time, you ever engage with somebody who has all the credentials in the world, and you ask them a simple question about a topic, you say, hey man, what do you think? What do you think about that? And they say, well, you know, as Kant said, and I said, what do you think? And you can't answer.
Right.
That's the people who look like you or are colonizers. All they know is what the oppressor gave them.
That's mimicry. That's
mimicry. That's not knowledge. That's not gift. That's not intelligence. It's simple mimicry. And here's the thing: those folks, the reason why they're so harmful, the reason why they're so hurtful to folks who look like them, is because they're afraid of being exposed for being parrots and not people.
There you go. There you go. Wow. You speak of being the guide and not the scribe, and that appealed to me. It spoke to me about the learning center approach to education, and it brought me to think about Paulo Freire and his work in the pedagogy of the oppressed.
One of my idols.
But to talk about the fact that so long after Freire's work, so long after Rodney's engagement. We are still stuck in that rut. Talk about the available paradigms of Western education, African education, and other methodologies that have been running across.
Buddhist tradition.
Yes.
In the restoration of rights to human beings. Brilliant work that we can use. Yeah.
Exactly. How is East and West? How are the minds? This if the world has a brain, has a left and a right brain. How are the two sides of the brain going to start working together? Talking about that in the midst of the activism for race. I'm still saying that isn't there some place down the road where humanity need to get it together? Where does that happen? Does it happen?
Brother, I would argue that the interruption of the full adoption of revolutionary frameworks came when we allowed institutions of education to adopt the language of revolution and extract it from the practice of revolution. So that a person can go and read Paulo Freire and get a PhD and not be expected to enact that work. So what we've done is we've taken revolutionary work, and people are smart. They'll adopt the language of it and intellectualize it, and then give you credential or props or attention for writing it down and not doing it. And so the interruption of revolutionary thought is when we stop placing emphasis on the enactment of that work. If somebody talk like I ask, well, what do you do? You said all that. What do you do? And if you can't answer what do you do or what have you done around the work, that's how the work dies. Anti-racism, newest term in contemporary education, spotted by every academic who's never touched a community of color. They're educationists, but they've never been in the classroom. So it's about the people holding the scholar, the intellectual, to the expectations of not just the articulation of revolutionary thought, but the enactment of revolutionary thought. You can't say it without doing it. And if the work only becomes about what you write down and what you say and not what you do, that work dies until it gets reimagined. And the idea here is in the contemporary reimagination of this philosophy, we expand it to include more strength on the doing than the saying and writing.
So the doing, the Rodney type of doing.
The doing
is where it is.
Rodney went in every community, man. He went to Guyana, left the university, went to the ghettos and to the hood. That's the work.
Yes.
If you can't do that, don't do anything.
Yes. There are some questions and comments. I'm gonna run through them as quickly as possible. Someone says, this is Sashania Walker. She's on YouTube. She says, but can't that forgiveness be seen as a flaw, always being forgiving?
It's forgiveness with high expectations, and it's forgiveness with restitution. So if you will be, the shame, it's not like the shame is erased. And it's not like that, and it's not like the expectation is diminished.
Yes. I
held you to this. You fell short.
Yes.
Publicly we say you fell short. These are what we expect for you to do to come up back. You're not going to be trusted right away, but we're not going to give you and throw you away. In the U.S. right now, we have a Ice Cube, one of my favorite rappers.
Yes.
He wrote a powerful song, F the Police, with NWA. I mean, revolutionary in the sense that he empowered a new generation to be able to see themselves as being able to fight back against systems of power.
Yes. 2
days ago, we discovered that Ice Cube went to sit with the current occupier of the White House.
Yes.
To construct a plan for Black America. Once this came released, those folks then said that he's endorsing them, and by 90% of the Black populace in the hip hop generation canceled Ice Cube. He's over with. How could he do that? I said, you can't cancel Ice Cube. Ice Cube who said F the police, F the system, F these folks in a record company that's abusing Black power and Black thought. Now, did Ice Cube make a gaffe in judgment? Absolutely. If I ever to see Ice Cube, I say, bro, you messed up. You have to make that one up to us. But I will not cancel Ice Cube because Ice Cube has more benefit to me in constructing a path forward than he does being canceled and then be relegated to not be able to influence the community. So forgiveness is forgiveness with high expectation and a path through restitution.
Yeah, yeah.
Than blind erasure of who can support us towards freedom.
Yes, yes, yes.
Let me give you an example. I ain't forgiving R. Kelly. Okay?
The room got silent.
They're egregious acts that cannot be forgiven.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But I ain't canceling Ice Cube.
Mm-hmm.
That's not smart.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. There you go. So Neil Edwards says, how does creating or uncovering new knowledge figure in with that view? Referring to when Chris said when he can go toe-to-toe with anyone on any subject.
Well, new knowledge is everywhere around us. That's the beauty of knowledge. That's the beauty of being an academic to me. The beauty of scholarship is not what I consume, but it's my approach to the world.
Yes.
So it's the same approach when I interrogate a book, but it's the same approach when I watch a young person construct a new dance, or when I hear a new tune. You know what I mean? When Sasco dropped Loco the other day, it blew my mind, right? Because he's just salient political commentary. So I can appreciate the genius of the commentary, but then I can also appreciate the genius of using the whole entire thing and look at the genius and brilliance in that artifact the same way that I look at the genius and the brilliance when I read Paulo Freire or when I and so it's knowledge is about the approach to information and the understanding that information and knowledge is generated all the time. You know, to see genius in a young person who has no bicycle, but can take a tire rod and a piece of metal and make a toy. Looking at the deep knowledge in that, the scientific knowledge in that, the mathematical knowledge in that, the sociological knowledge in that, the psychological knowledge in that I look through the world through the lens of seeing the genius of my people. And that is new knowledge.
Yes, yes. Brilliant. The purpose of education being for liberation. There is a new education transformation mission that this country has just set up.
I'm aware.
Headed by Professor Orlando Patterson.
Yes.
I were to advise, just based on what you're saying, and you really said it all, but what would be your first and most fundamental suggestions for the education of persons in a country with the history and the people that Jamaica has?
If you want to make it practical first, I'll say, go talk to Renee Ratchet. And I have no idea why she's not on that commission.
She's in the room.
Right. And that's the first thing I would say about that commission.
Yes.
Because you see someone who understands the landscape of education, who's been an educator, who's been a school leader, who holds high sense of her own comfort to ensure it right, who understands dancehall culture, who understands high academic culture, who works within community. So the first thing I would say is, why don't you have her on there first? Second, I would say, more important than having folks of high experience in education is identifying folks who've had negative experiences in the education system and inviting them to contribute to it. You can learn more from a person who the system has failed than from the person who's been successful within the system if the system itself is broken.
Yes.
So we need a consortium of folks who have been kicked out, dropped out, left out, or paying a restitution by paying them financially for their insight, to articulate for us where we've gone wrong, because we knew they were genius, but we did something wrong to have them out. So those are my two basic tenets. I could go further, but in the interest of time, we'll stop there.
He says, powerful statement, curriculum of underdevelopment. Mona first year experiences, that is a conversation that I'm hearing a lot, the disempowering nature of schools.
Yeah.
COVID presents an opportunity to revise the goals of an education system.
Indeed.
And Ratchet says, lack of self or self-worth learned in schools. This assignment says, I'm happy to see Dr. Emdin here, TC.
Got another TC alum, another Columbia alum.
In the house, yeah.
That's right.
I see a question coming in here. It says, what do you consider activism? I think some clarity would help me connect the dots here. So if you could just elaborate on the term that you've been using, activism.
Yeah, I mean, you know, activism is acting in the interest of the betterment of your people. That's my definition. I'm sure there are more canonical definitions, but persistently acting in the interest of your people is activism. And so when I say everyday activism, is that in every single day you ask yourself, what can I do for the betterment of self? But then also, what can I do for the betterment of my people? one thing will I do today to ensure that someone who looks like me, sounds like me, feels like me, who may be in a less than position than me, is empowered, engaged, and in a better position than they've previously been. And sometimes the answer is something practical you can do. Sometimes it's in what you can read that you can share with someone, but it's about this ongoing process of looking at the world through processes we can all engage in for our collective betterment. That's my stance on it. And you access this position and state of activism by forcing yourself to think of things other than yourself. For me, it's about affirmations. I didn't get practical into the pedagogy, but it's like, if I want to hold on to a certain kind of thinking, I surround myself with people and things and words and phrases that support that way of thinking in a sort of like James Allen-esque kind of way. Like, you are who you are around. As a man thinketh, so is he. And so if you fully believe in the ideological concept of activism, then you must make that practical by pursuing things or putting yourself in the environment or around people that support that way of thought. And so all of a sudden then what's in thought is merged with what you're around and who you engage with. And then who you are shifts and bends towards the type of self you want to become.
Thanks for that. And I have a question to myself. I noticed that you spoke a lot about race, and I understand coming from a racialized society in the United States. In the Caribbean, there's also the elements of class. And I also saw the way in which you talked about Ratchet. I could see the connection of ratchetness is not just about race, but class. So I wanted you to speak to that in how that would transcend within the Caribbean context.
Oh, sister, a brilliant question, seamlessly. And it's my mistake if I didn't make the connections explicit. When I say race and different races in that way, when I talk about white folks, I ain't talking about Caucasian folks. I'm talking about black folks or white supremacist ideologies embedded in their consciousness who enact oppression on black folks and don't think that they can associate themselves with folks who look like them. So, to me, whiteness is a construct, and class is oftentimes how that gets manifested. So folks of high class who adopt, white supremacist ideologies, in many ways, to me, are white folks. There's a phrase in the Southern United States: all kinfolk ain't skinfolk. So just because folks got the same skin as you don't mean they kin. And here's the interesting part of it as well: not because certain folks have a different skin doesn't mean that they're not psychological and emotional kin. And so, white folks, for me, my book for white folks who teach in the hood, and the rest of y'all too. When I talk about white folks, I ain't talking about just white people, right? And I think, thank you so much for bringing that up, that class, closeness to particular ideologies and ways of thinking, perceptions of folks who look like you as less than, self-hate because of who you are and where you came from. Concepts I outlined are applicable to those concepts and constructs as well.
Thanks for the response. I'm just going to take something from before we wrap up. I see a comment here from a Zonder Z. His comment, he says, collective betterment is interesting, especially given that some of our community are satisfied with the existence. Did you want to make a...
Yeah, I understand the challenge of that. But I want us also to understand that the reason why some of our folks are comfortable with their existence, and Walter Rodney articulated this brilliantly when he talked about, when we talk about protest and violence, and you say, look at those violent people, and it's those folks getting at the end of their rope and saying, what? And sometimes apathy is a way to soothe disenchantment. Sometimes it's easy to say, you know what, I'm okay. Because the rage that comes with the awareness will almost drive a person mad. And the madness of awareness must be translated into action. And if that person that's seen that the madness and the rage of being seen as less than cannot be connected to and with, they become apathetic. And so I always say, some folks are comfortable. It's a function of what society has done. And the apathetic, when their souls get ignited, have all that pent up frustration that laid dormant for a while, and they're ready to go. And I find that with young people, when I teach a 7th or 8th grader or a 9th grader who's had a negative experience in school their whole entire life, and then they get into my class and like, I don't care about physics, I don't care about chemistry, complete apathy. and then you strike that match that ignites their soul. All those years of pent-up frustration, all those years of pent-up feeling, all those years of pent-up emotion gets released. And when it gets released, my job as the educator is bend that towards the belief in self and the learning of content knowledge. So, you know, apathy is oftentimes a sedative when the pain of reality is too harsh. And so we must also treat folks with kindness to understand where that's birthed from and then work to ignite it.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. And I think we're not going to wrap up yet. I thought we were going to, but there are some comments coming in. There's energy, right? The energy is here.
Yeah.
I think your last comment goes well with this question or this comment again, if you probably want to speak to it. It says, education can't liberate anyone if it's not designed around the lived experience and needs of people. Consulting an expert is top down, same old, same old. So I know you want to speak to that because
I agree.
We're going into that as you were talking about the students responding to, I suppose, the hip hop that you're using. Go ahead.
Yeah, and we did Science Genius Jamaica, and the dancehall tracks that these young folks came up with was absolutely brilliant, and testimonials from the young people that sent us a note and said, listen, after writing this song with dancehall, I look at my test scores and I did better on this part that I wrote the rap about. So, it's responding to young folks, but it's bigger than responding to, it's responding for the young folks who've been historically marginalized. And this idea of like going to an expert, it depends what the expert is doing, or if the person perceives themselves to be expert. Like I've been brought in to go talk to places, and I don't consider myself an expert. I consider myself an igniter. I consider myself a catalyst. I don't consider myself an expert. I know I am knowledgeable. I ensure I am knowledgeable. I know I am an expert in myself and who I am and how I come into the world. And I go to any space knowing I'm an expert in who I am. I am a vessel for something bigger than me. And I'm operating with a purpose of the betterment of my people. And if my work is to ignite the people to do what they do, I just ignite and move out the way. And I think if it's about who you perceive as expert in what? Do they see themselves as expert? Do they see themselves as bigger and greater than? It's all those questions wrapped into that position or title of expert.
And I was at your launch, Jamaica, when you did that.
Dope.
And I was able to see that not only just the excitement, but the way in which the students were able to use their lived experience, and they were able to use dancehall to come up with science. I remember there was an exercise that they did where they were talking about the digestive system. And it's right. Yeah, it's still me. So you're absolutely right. And I'm going to get a little controversy here.
It's always good. Good discourse based on opposing viewpoints.
And that's a part of being Ratchet, is the controversy, right? So
yeah, of course.
Yeah, Ratchet is not just about niceness. So with an opposing views, asking clarification when he's saying he hasn't gotten yet. So he says, quote, "You are not a radical thinker like Rodney. You are a radical reductionist." So how would you respond to such a
reductionist
comment?
A person who makes an argument that someone's framework or ideology or approach to thinking is reductionist is operating from a perception that something else is an ideal. And I don't believe that there's an ideal that makes my idea a reductionist theory. Rather, I think it's one that is a ground up theory. It's one that's constructed based on my viewpoints. And that person is entitled to their position. Like, look, I don't do my work to be, to have everybody agree with me. I do my work to operate in the fullness of who I am and who I'm designed to be. So I don't aspire to have agreement. I aspire to ignite thought. This person looks at Walter Rodney as I do, as a revolutionary. At least we have something in common. I believe that. And my work is not to be perceived as radical or not. It's to be perceived as my truth and an amalgamation of all who I have read that inform my thinking, including Walter Rodney. And oftentimes folks like to canonize Rodney, right? He was a great intellectual in XYZ tradition because I've read all his work. Yeah, but what do you do that is about what he does? When you write academic work, do you write it in prose? And so folks will perceive my perception as reductionist if they view Walter Rodney's work through the lens of the canonizing of that work. And my perception is always about the application of said work. And so, we got opposing viewpoints. I ain't mad. You do you and I do me.
We all know that we take up the mantle of our, warriors and political, when we go back to, let's say, Black intellectualism, we're not going to always be in the exact frame.
And we're not supposed to.
Yes, and we're
not supposed to. We're not intended to. Yeah. We weren't designed to, but we are designed to honor and respect each other. And we're designed to work collectively towards our collective emancipation, period.
Okay. All right. And with that said, there are no more comments or questions.
Love, man. I appreciate y'all for having me.
Yes. And on behalf of the Institute of Caribbean Studies, UWI Mona, I just want to thank you, a big thank you, or big up. I'm going to get Ratchet here. Big up your lecture on this.
Yeah, man. I appreciate that.
Yes. And I especially want to just very, very quickly, I want to thank you also for reminding us, I wrote it here, like, reminding us the significance of breaking or reimagining our history.
Yeah.
It's not just about it, while it involves decolonizing or breaking down educational system. Yeah. I really like the idea of where you remind us about giving words new meaning that will empower us, and using those said meaning the way in which you're using Ratchet to our own freedom of expression. Because I was thinking about, as you were speaking about this ratchetness and so forth, in terms of how within the Caribbean, the way in which the region, we're still, in terms of government and officializing our nation languages, as Rodney would speak about our patois. And again, that in that process, it robs many people of that freedom of expression that you spoke about earlier. So I want to thank you for that reminder. And that is something.
Yeah, all love, man. Like, yeah, I appreciate you. I appreciate the thoughts. Yes. And for me, the notion that we're still having that argument about patois, it's just ridiculous. And it speaks to the extent through which we've all, so many folks have adopted an approach to looking at the world that is about a hatred of themselves. But it is what it is. Onwards towards freedom, you know what I mean?
And yes, I want to also thank the team, the ICS, the Institute of Caribbean Studies, for putting together this annual Walter Rodney event. And the director, Dr. Stanley Naya, as well as our incredible ICS office staff, Bettine Ross Laws and Katie Ann Williams, and our IT support, Isabel Dennis. I want to thank those as well, and we want to thank them as well. And thanks to all the participants, our very own MC and Vibes Master, who can be Ratchet too, right?
You. Yeah.
Who left us, but he's still here in spirit. And Professor Donna Hope for her welcome, and her Ratchet background. I want to thank for it. It really spoke to your lecture. It really fit in very well. Irvin Hall players, thank you to the Irvin Hall players. Thank you for the Ratchet message that you presented through your dramatic performance. Again, there was some ratchetness coming out of there. And finally, I want to thank the viewers who took the time out this evening to join us from near and far, and just to commemorate, to help us to commemorate our 22nd annual Walter Rodney lecture. Because in this new world of virtual activities, expanded virtual activities, they could have been anywhere else in any other virtual Ratchet activities, and they chose to stay with us and be Ratchet with us this evening. So I just want to thank everyone, and wishing everyone a safe and good evening. And again, just to remember the ratchetness in terms of the way in which we could reimagine words and just use it to empower us. Have a good evening, everyone.